I have never told this story from beginning to end, not to anyone, not even to the people who think they know me well, the ones who sit across from me at dinner tables in Los Angeles and assume they understand how I got here. They know the resume, they know the films, they know the awards on the shelf in my office, and the projects in development, and the name that gets mentioned when people talk about the next generation of American producers. What they don't know is where it all started. What they don't know is the name Paige Collins, and what she did to me, and what I did with it. This is that story. All of it. And I want to be honest with you, because I think honesty is the only thing that makes a story like this worth telling. I didn't become who I am despite what happened. I became who I am because of it. And whether that's something to be proud of, I genuinely don't know. Maybe you'll decide for me. Let me take you back to a time when I had no idea who I was going to become, because that's important. You need to understand the before. You need to understand what kind of person I was before all of this happened, because the before shapes everything that comes after. I grew up in a mid-sized city in Ohio, the kind of place where the horizon is flat, and the winters are long, and the options feel finite, unless you're willing to imagine your way out. My family wasn't poor exactly, but we were always close enough to the edge that money had texture in our house. My father worked at a parts distribution facility. My mother worked part-time at a dentist's office on the east side of town. We lived in a house that was ours, but just barely. We drove cars that ran, but only with careful attention. We ate well, but nothing was wasted. I want to be clear. I don't say this for sympathy. I say it because it explains my psychology. Growing up like that teaches you certain things. It teaches you that nothing is guaranteed. It teaches you that comfort is earned and that it can be taken away without warning. It teaches you to watch carefully and speak less than you think, and work harder than you need to, because there is no safety net below you. And it teaches you that the people who have more than you don't necessarily deserve it more than you. They've just been positioned differently. And position is something you can change over time if you're patient and disciplined, and willing to endure the stretch of years when nothing seems to be moving. From the time I was maybe 13 or 14, I was obsessed with film. Not in the casual way a lot of teenagers are obsessed with movies. I mean genuinely, structurally obsessed. I wasn't just watching films, I was studying them. I'd pause scenes and look at the lighting. I'd rewind dialogue and think about the choices the writers made. I'd read interviews with directors and producers and cinematographers and try to understand the machinery underneath the emotion. I borrowed books from the library about film history, about the studio system, about independent financing, about distribution. I took notes in notebooks that I kept under my bed, not because anyone told me to, but because I needed somewhere to put all of it. My parents were supportive in the way that working people are supportive of a child's dreams. They didn't discourage me, but they didn't have the resources or the connections to help me advance. My father once told me that he didn't understand what I was doing, but that he could see I was serious about it, and that serious people tend to find their way. I've held on to that. It's a simple thing to say, but it meant something coming from him. By the time I was in high school, I was working evenings at a grocery store to save money for equipment. I bought a used camera that was 2 generations old and spent a semester learning it the way some kids learn a musical instrument. Methodically, by doing it wrong many times before doing it right. I made short films on weekends, nothing impressive, neighborhood scenes, my parents' kitchen, a park near the high school where the light came through the trees in a way that made me feel like I was seeing something true. Nobody at school really knew about this. I wasn't unpopular exactly, but I wasn't embedded in the social architecture of the place either. I had a few friends, guys I'd known since middle school, easy and low-maintenance friendships built on shared humor and not asking too much of each other. I wasn't on any teams. I wasn't in the drama club. which I now find slightly ironic given everything. I was just there, moving through the days quietly, working my job in the evenings, filming on weekends, reading at night. I want you to understand something about my emotional life at that age, because it matters for what comes next. I was not cynical. I know that sounds like something people say before they describe how they became cynical, and maybe it is, but I want to be precise about this. I was genuinely open. I believed that people were roughly who they presented themselves to be. I believed that when someone gave you attention, it meant something. I had not yet learned that some people are strategic in their warmth in the same way a hunter is strategic about bait. I had not yet developed the part of myself that watches and measures and waits. That part would come later. It would be built out of necessity, but that's later. That's not yet. Our high school was the kind of place that had a clear social order, and the social order was enforced without anyone ever having to articulate it. There were the athletes at the top, then the student council types, then various clusters of belonging arranged in a rough hierarchy below that, and then everyone else. The system was not cruel exactly, it was simply efficient. People knew where they stood. Most of us accepted our position and got on with things. The drama department had its own kind of prestige, though it was a different currency than the athletic currency. The theater kids were visible in a specific way. They commanded attention in the hallways. They had an energy that was performative even off stage, and the best ones had a kind of magnetism that was hard to ignore, even if you weren't in their world. Paige Collins was the undisputed center of that world. I want to be careful here, because I'm aware of how easy it is to flatten someone into a villain when you're telling a story about how they hurt you. I don't want to do that. I want to describe her accurately, because accuracy is more interesting than caricature, and because I think the accurate version of Paige Collins is more damning than any caricature could be. She was genuinely talented. I need to say that first and say it plainly, because it's true, and because the story doesn't make sense without it. She had a natural command of a room that I'd rarely seen in someone that age. She could walk into a space and shift its center of gravity toward herself without appearing to try. She knew how to use silence in a conversation, knew how to make you feel, when she looked at you, that she was seeing something specific and true about you. She was funny. Actually funny. Not the aggressive kind of funny that some beautiful people use as a defensive weapon, but genuinely quick and light. She was good at accents. She could cry on command. I watched her in the spring play junior year. She played the lead. And even sitting in the audience with no particular investment in the production, I felt something move in my chest in the scene where her character realizes she's been deceived. The irony of that moment would not become clear to me for several more months. Off stage, she moved through the school with an ease that I think came from never having seriously doubted herself. She had a group of close friends. Lauren and Jasmine were the core of it, always nearby, always laughing at the right moments. She dated a guy from the basketball team for a while, then didn't, and the way she handled the transition made it clear she had decided when it ended. She talked openly about her plans for after graduation. She was going to New York or maybe Los Angeles, she hadn't decided, and she was going to study acting at a serious conservatory and then work her way into film and television. She said this without the self-consciousness that usually accompanies big declarations. She said it the way you'd say you were planning to drive to the grocery store. I registered all of this from a distance. I was aware of her the way you're aware of weather, as a feature of the environment rather than something that directly concerns you. I didn't fantasize about her. I didn't write her name anywhere. I was too busy with my own things, my camera and my notebooks, and my evenings at the grocery store, to spend much energy on someone who existed in a completely different orbit, which is what made it so unexpected when she stepped out of that orbit and into mine. It was November of senior year when it started. I was in the library during a free period, watching a clip on my laptop with headphones in. A behind-the-scenes documentary about a production I'd been studying. I was taking notes in my notebook, not paying attention to anything else in the room, when someone sat down across from me without asking. I looked up. It was Paige Collins. She was looking at my screen. "Is that a behind-the-scenes doc?" she asked. I said yes and told her what it was. She asked if she could see. I turned the laptop slightly toward her, and she watched for a moment, and then she said something that surprised me. She asked if I knew anything about self-tape audition setups. Not in a general way. Specifically, she wanted to know about lighting and framing, and how to make a home setup look professional. I knew exactly what she was asking about, and I told her. I talked about the three-point lighting system, about background choices, about how to use a neutral wall to your advantage, about the distance from the lens relative to the shot type she'd need. I talked for maybe 10 minutes without stopping, and she listened with her whole body, leaning in slightly, asking clarifying questions that were more specific than I expected from someone who hadn't been in this conversation before. When I finished, she said, "Do you do this? Like film people?" I told her I filmed things, short films mostly. I was still learning. She said she'd been auditioning for a summer program, an acting intensive run by a conservatory in the Northeast, and she needed a better audition tape and didn't trust what she'd been producing on her phone. She asked if I'd be willing to help her. I don't remember exactly what I was feeling in that moment. Some version of surprise, some version of mild excitement at a project that would stretch my skills, some version of something more personal that I wasn't ready to name yet. I said yes. That was the beginning. What followed over the next several months was something I still find difficult to describe without getting the proportions wrong, because the external reality and my internal experience of it were very different things, and only one of them was accurate. The external reality was this. I helped Paige Collins with her acting career materials. I set up a filming space in my basement with borrowed lights and a clean white background, and filmed her audition monologues. I helped her select which takes were strongest and why. Not from an acting perspective, because she didn't need that from me, but from a technical perspective, from a camera and framing perspective, from the perspective of what reads as confident and present on a screen. I edited her audition tapes. I filmed her portfolio videos. I helped her format her applications. I read the application essays she wrote and gave her honest feedback, including feedback she didn't always want to hear. Feedback I gave her carefully because I was figuring out the shape of her sensitivity in real time. We spent a lot of time together in those months, more than I'd expected. She would come to my house on Saturday afternoons, and we'd work for 3 or 4 hours, and then she'd stay, and we'd talk. She was easy to talk to. She asked questions that seemed real. She listened. She made me feel, consistently, that the things I thought and the things I was working toward mattered to someone other than myself. I started to feel like I knew her. I started to feel like she knew me. My internal experience of this was significantly warmer than the external reality warranted. I was falling for her. I didn't say it, not even to myself in those early months. But looking back, I can see it clearly in the way my weeks organized themselves around the Saturday afternoons. The way I'd find myself thinking about things I wanted to tell her during the week. The way a text from her would change the quality of a day. It wasn't infatuation exactly. It was slower and quieter than that. More domestic somehow. It was the feeling of believing you've found someone who sees you. She never said anything explicit. She never made a move. But she was warm in ways that had edges to them. Warm in ways that implied more than friendship without ever committing to more than friendship. A hand on the arm during a conversation. A look held a beat longer than necessary. Small moments of closeness that felt like signals, even though I understood they might not be. I told myself I was being careful. I told myself I wasn't projecting. I told myself I was reading the situation accurately. I was wrong about all 3 of those things. There is a particular kind of pain that comes not from a confrontation, but from an absence of one. From learning something you were never meant to know, through a channel you were never meant to access. There's no way to respond to it. There's no one to direct the pain towards, because the person who caused it doesn't know you know. You just hold it alone, and the holding is the thing that does the damage. A week before graduation, I was in the school's east wing after the final bell, walking past the row of lockers near the drama department's storage room. The door was ajar. I wasn't paying attention to it. I was thinking about a film I'd been working on that weekend, running a framing problem through my head, not really present in the hallway at all. And then I heard her laughing. The laugh I recognized immediately. It was the laugh she did when something struck her as genuinely funny rather than socially funny. A little lower, a little less controlled. I slowed involuntarily without deciding to. I don't know why. Some part of me recognized, before the rest of me did, that something was happening. Lauren's voice. "So are you going to tell him before you leave?" Paige, still laughing, half exasperated. "Tell him what, Jasmine? That you're leaving. That it's been fun. That he shouldn't wait. Paige. He knows I'm leaving. We all know we're leaving. That's what graduation is." Lauren. "You know what I mean." A pause. Then Paige in a different register, lighter, almost clinical. "It was never that kind of thing. He's sweet, but come on, he was genuinely useful. The camera stuff, the editing. I couldn't have gotten into the program without those tapes, and you know it." Jasmine. "That's kind of cold." Paige. "It's not cold, it's honest. Every actress in her development phase needs a personal assistant. I just got mine to come with a crush attached so he'd work harder." A beat of laughter from all three of them. The emotional investment made him better at the job. He was invested in making me look good. I'd do it again. Lauren. "Does he know he was the personal assistant?" Paige. "God, no. That's the whole point. The best assistant is one who doesn't know they're the assistant." More laughter. Then Jasmine. "You're terrible." Paige, cheerfully. "I'm prepared." I stood in the hallway and didn't move for what felt like a long time. The conversation continued. They moved on to other topics. Something about graduation parties. I stopped processing the words. I was standing very still, with my hand slightly raised near the locker I'd been about to pass, like a photograph of a person mid-step. Then I walked to the parking lot and sat in my car and didn't start it for 20 minutes. I want to describe what I felt in those 20 minutes as accurately as I can, because it's important, and because I've thought about it many times since. It wasn't pure anger, it wasn't pure humiliation, it was something more complex than either of those things, a kind of retroactive erasure, a sensation of watching a large section of the past several months dissolve and reform into something unrecognizable. Every afternoon in the basement, every text I'd spent time thinking about how to answer, every moment I'd thought was evidence of something real. None of it had been real. All of it had been a tool. I had been a tool. And the worst part, the part that would take me years to fully process, was that she had been right. I had worked harder because I was invested. The tapes I'd made for her were some of the best work I'd done up to that point. She had correctly identified something in me and used it with precision and without guilt. She hadn't been cruel in the ordinary sense. She'd been strategic, and in the moment of standing outside that door, the efficiency of it felt worse than cruelty would have. I drove home. I told no one. I didn't know what I would have said. A week later, we graduated. She left for the East Coast. I stayed in Ohio and started working. Here is where I need to tell you something that does not reflect well on me, and I'm going to tell you anyway, because leaving it out would make the story dishonest. For about a year after graduation, I carried what had happened in a way that was not healthy and not productive. I'm not talking about grief exactly, though there was some of that. I'm talking about something more corrosive, a constant internal rehearsal of what I would do when I became successful enough that she would need something from me. I would lie in bed at night and play out these scenarios in elaborate detail. The moment she would reach out, the tone I would take, the exact words I would use. I had versions of this conversation that lasted hours in my head. This was my major strategic mistake, and it was significant. The problem with organizing your ambition around a fantasy of revenge is that it corrupts the ambition itself. It introduces a secondary motive that sits underneath the primary motive and quietly destabilizes it. You tell yourself you're working toward something, but what you're really doing is working toward a performance, toward the moment when you can display what you've achieved in front of the person who discarded you, and that performance is the wrong destination. It keeps you oriented toward the past instead of toward the future. It makes the quality of your present life dependent on the imagined reaction of someone who has already demonstrated they don't particularly care about you. I spent about a year in Ohio doing entry-level work on film sets. Production assistant roles mostly. Unglamorous, largely invisible work that involves a lot of moving equipment and standing in the right place, and learning the organizational structure of a production from the inside. This is the correct way to start. I knew that, and I was doing it correctly. But I was doing it with a poison underneath it. This constant humming fantasy of vindication that distorted my relationship with the work itself. The practical consequence was that I made a decision that set me back. About 14 months after graduation, I had a chance to take a coordinator role with a small production company that was doing interesting regional work. Not glamorous, but substantive. The kind of work that builds real knowledge and real relationships. I turned it down because the company's trajectory wasn't impressive enough to satisfy the fantasy I was running in my head. I needed my success to be visible and large and undeniable, which meant I was trying to skip steps, which meant I was not thinking clearly about how careers actually develop. I spent another 8 months doing the same level of work I'd been doing before. I went nowhere. And at some point during those 8 months, sitting in the parking lot of a set location in Cleveland in the early morning before call time, I had a moment of something that I can only describe as clarity with an ugly face on it. I realized that I was using her to avoid taking responsibility for my own path. She was an abstraction I'd been using to generate motivation, but abstractions make poor fuels. They burn hot and dirty and don't last. And more than that, I realized that the person I was trying to become, the person who would eventually stand in front of her with all of this behind him, that person was not going to emerge from the swamp of resentment I was wading through. That person required something cleaner, something more internal. I had to put the fantasy down. Not forever, not entirely, but down enough to build a foundation that wasn't poisoned. This is easier to describe than it was to do. It took several more months before I actually did it, but I did it. Eventually I did it. Before the rebuilding, there was a period of isolation that I need to describe because it was real, and because pretending it wasn't would be a lie of omission. I was 21, 22 during those years. My friends from high school had scattered. A few had stayed in Ohio, but were on different tracks. College, then jobs, then the early architecture of adult life. We stayed in touch loosely, the way people do when geography and diverging rhythms have eroded the daily texture of closeness. I was working irregular hours. I was saving as much of what I earned as I could, which meant I wasn't going out much, wasn't socializing much, wasn't building new relationships in the way that most people my age were building them. I lived in a one-bedroom apartment that was clean and spare, and which I kept very organized, because control over small things is a way of managing the feeling that larger things are out of control. I was genuinely lonely in those years. Not devastated lonely, not crisis lonely, but a persistent low-grade loneliness that colored everything slightly gray. I'd come home from a 14-hour day on a set and sit in my apartment and feel the specific quiet of a space where no one knows you're there. I'd think about calling someone and then not call. I'd think about making plans and then decide it was too complicated. Part of this was practical. My schedule was genuinely difficult, but part of it was something I was choosing, though I didn't fully understand at the time that I was choosing it. I had retreated into myself in a way that felt like discipline, but was at least partly avoidance. If you don't let people close, they can't take the closeness away from you. If you don't invest in anyone, no one can reveal that the investment was foolish. I wasn't making that calculation consciously, but I was making it. I also wasn't talking to anyone about what had happened with Paige. This is worth noting because it meant the experience sat inside me without the modulation that comes from putting something into language for another person. It just sat there, taking up room in its original unprocessed form. And things that aren't processed tend to grow in the dark. I want to be fair to myself here. I was also working, consistently, seriously, without complaint. I was learning things that would later matter enormously: the economics of small budget productions, the relationship between financing structures and creative control, the way distribution decisions downstream affect what gets made upstream. I was absorbing all of it. I was building even in the dark, even through the isolation, even through the poison of the fantasy I was slowly, painfully teaching myself to put down. I was building. But the isolation was real, and it cost me. It delayed things. It made the rebuilding longer and harder than it needed to be. I want to be honest about that. There was a particular moment, I was 23, when I was certain that nothing was going to happen for me. Not cynically certain, not dramatically certain, just quietly, factually certain in the way you're certain about weather. I had been passed over for a coordinator promotion at the production company where I'd been working for nearly 2 years. The job went to someone who had come in 6 months after me and had a connection to the company's managing director through a family relationship. He was fine at the job, not extraordinary, but fine. And I sat in my car in that parking lot again, and I thought, this is how it works. This is the actual system. You can study it and work it and show up and do everything right, and when it matters, it will still come down to who someone's cousin knows. I thought about Paige Collins for the first time in a while. Not the fantasy version, not the revenge scenario. Just her actual face, her actual voice saying the words I'd heard outside that storage room. The professional ease with which she had assessed me and used me and moved on. And I thought, she understood something real. She understood that in environments structured around soft social capital, you have to think strategically about relationships. You have to understand what you are to the people around you and what they are to you. I didn't want to become her, but I needed to understand the mechanism. That period, from about 23 to 25, was the lowest professional phase of my life. I was stagnant. The people I'd come up with were beginning to separate into those who were going somewhere and those who weren't. And I was positioned ambiguously, not clearly failing but not clearly ascending. I was doing adequate work for adequate pay and learning things that weren't visible to anyone outside my own head. I took a second job. I'm not going to make this sound noble. It was survival motivated. I was working evenings and weekends doing freelance video editing for small businesses, corporate videos, the kind of work that doesn't make it into any portfolio worth looking at. But I was saving money. Every month I was putting money away, more than was comfortable, and I was watching it accumulate. I didn't know what the money was for yet. I just knew that money was a form of flexibility, and that flexibility was what I needed more than anything else. I was reading constantly during this period: financial modeling, business of entertainment, film distribution structures, case studies on independent production companies that had broken through. I wasn't reading in the way a student reads to pass a test. I was reading the way you study a game you're preparing to play, absorbing the rules and the patterns and the failures and the exceptions until the structure of it was as clear to me as anything I knew. I was building something. I just couldn't see its shape yet. And from the outside, From the perspective of anyone who knew me from high school, from the perspective of anyone following my career at that point, it looked like nothing was happening. Which is a useful thing, I would later understand. Being invisible during the accumulation phase is an advantage. The people who need you to know they're doing well are announcing their hand too early. 25 was when the shape started to appear. I left the production company I'd been working at, amicably, professionally, without burning anything, and took a role with a smaller operation that was doing something more interesting. It was a company run by a guy named Owen Bradley, who had been producing regional independent films for 15 years, and who had a reputation in the industry for being meticulous, difficult, and almost always right. He was not a warm person. He was not a mentor in the conventional sense. But he had something I needed, a real education in the economics of independent film, delivered without sentimentality. I want to tell you about the first 6 months working for Owen, because those months were formative in a way that I don't think I could have manufactured through any other path. He ran a small operation, 4 full-time staff himself, a rotating cast of contractors. The office was in a converted warehouse space on the east side of the city, and it was aggressively practical. No art on the walls, no decorative anything, good equipment and functional furniture, and a coffee machine that was always on. He worked long hours without comment and expected the same. He had no patience for hedging or for soft answers. When he asked you a question and you weren't sure of the answer, the correct response was to say exactly that. I don't know, but I can find out by tomorrow, and then find out by tomorrow. Any other response, any version of a guess dressed as a certainty, he would take apart in front of you without anger, but with surgical precision, and you would not make that mistake again. I learned more from Owen in 3 years than I had in the 4 years before. Not just about production, about the whole ecosystem, about how financing conversations actually happen, who holds real leverage in a distribution negotiation, how to read a budget to understand what someone actually values versus what they're willing to let go. He taught me to think about film as an industry in a way that I'd been approaching from the outside, but had never fully inhabited. And I was putting away money, still, every month, more than before now that I was earning more. I had a small investment portfolio that I tended with the same careful attention I gave everything else. Nothing spectacular. I wasn't a financial genius, but disciplined, consistent, and growing. I was also, for the first time since high school, starting to build relationships that weren't transactional. There were 2 or 3 people in Owen's orbit who became genuinely important to me. A cinematographer named Trevor Collins, who had the most rigorous visual intelligence I'd ever encountered, and a woman named Nina Edwards, who was an actress-turned-producer, and who would later become significant in a different way that I'll come to. These people knew me, not the performance of me, not the professional face I'd learned to present. They knew the actual texture of how I thought and what I cared about, and where I was uncertain. The isolation was ending, slowly, incompletely, but ending. During this period, I also made a quiet decision about Paige Collins, not a dramatic decision, no moment of fireworks, no ritual, just a quiet, private understanding that I reached in my apartment one evening while reading a case study about a distribution deal. I understood that what had happened to me was useful, not pleasant, not okay, but useful. It had given me a very early lesson in the gap between how people present themselves and what they're actually doing, in the way warmth can be strategic and attention can be instrumental. I'd been a tool because I hadn't understood the game being played. I understood it now. I wasn't going to forgive her in the sense of releasing the memory. I wasn't interested in that. But I was done running the fantasy, done letting her exist as a destination in my imagination. Whatever happened next, if anything ever happened next, would happen because I had built something real, not because I was assembling props for a scene I'd scripted. That distinction, I would discover, was everything. 27 through 30 were the years when the invisible work started to become visible. Owen retired earlier than anyone expected, a health situation that he handled with the same no-drama pragmatism he brought to everything. And when he stepped back, he did something that I still don't entirely understand, but for which I will be permanently grateful. He pointed his clients and his relationships at me. Not formally, not with fanfare. He just started telling the people he worked with that when they called him, they should be talking to me instead. Within 6 months, I had inherited enough of the connective tissue of his operation to form my own company. I won't pretend this wasn't a form of luck. It was. But I want to be precise about what kind of luck it was. It was the luck of being positioned correctly when an unexpected opportunity appeared. The positioning was not luck. The positioning was years of being reliably present, reliably right about hard things, reliably calm when calm was difficult, and reliably honest when honesty was what Owen needed, rather than what he wanted. You earn the luck by doing the work that makes you someone a retiring person wants to leave things to. I called my company Lawson Gate, my mother's maiden name for the first word, gate, because I thought of it as a threshold rather than a destination. The name meant nothing to anyone except me. That was intentional. The first 3 years of Lawson Gate were not dramatic. We did mid-sized projects, not the kind of work that makes headlines, but consistent quality productions that started to establish a reputation in the industry for being done well and finished on time and on budget. In an industry where neither of those things is particularly common, that reputation is worth more than any single high-profile film. I was learning financing from the investor side now, not just the production side. I was in rooms with people who had money to place and who were evaluating projects, and I was understanding what they were actually looking for, not just the story pitch, but the structural soundness, the distribution plan, the talent relationships, the risk mitigation. I was becoming fluent in a language I'd been learning for a decade. At 32, I attached to my first major project, a film that had a real budget, real talent, real distribution ambitions. I won't name it here because the story isn't about the titles. The film did well, not spectacularly, but solidly. It got noticed. The right people noticed it. My name started to appear in articles, not profile pieces, not yet, but mentions in trade coverage of films I'd produced, acknowledgments in reviews that noted the quality of the production work. Industry people started to know who I was. Not everyone, but the people who mattered in the specific circles I was operating in. By 34, Lawson Gate was at a level where a major project, a genuine awards-adjacent wide-release production, was within reach. Not guaranteed, not certain, but within reach. Paige Collins, during this entire period, was somewhere in the peripheral vision of the industry. I knew she was there the way you know about weather in a city you don't live in. There was information available if you looked, and I sometimes looked, without intending to analyze what I found. What I found was a career that had the shape of a lot of acting careers, promising beginnings, a few real opportunities, and then the slow drift toward a plateau that most people in that industry find themselves on, regardless of talent, regardless of effort. She had done solid work in a few productions, supporting roles, 1 or 2 things that got decent reviews. She had the resume of someone who had made it into the industry but not through it, the kind of actress who gets auditioned for things she doesn't get, who is credible but not compelling to the people who make the decisions that matter. I understood exactly how that happened. I had been in those rooms. I had watched the decisions get made. Talent is not the only variable, and she had talent. What she lacked was the structural positioning that turns talent into a career, and structural positioning is not a thing that charm and self-belief alone can manufacture. You need someone in the right position to be invested in your success, and the way she had chosen to relate to people in that position, instrumentally, strategically, without genuine reciprocity, had not served her. I noted this without satisfaction, or rather, with something less clean and less simple than satisfaction. Something I'm still not sure I have the right word for. There's a shift that happens when you've been building something long enough. It doesn't announce itself. You don't wake up one morning and find it in place. It accretes, the way rock forms, slowly, under pressure, through the accumulated weight of time and consistent action. I noticed it first in rooms, the way the center of gravity in a conversation would shift toward me without my doing anything to create that shift. The way junior people in the industry would position themselves near me at events. Not because I'd done anything to attract them, but because in the ecosystem of the industry, my name had become a signal, and people wanted proximity to signals. The way established people who had once been casually indifferent to my presence now engaged with a different quality of attention. Trevor told me once, around this time, that I had become one of those people who others talk about differently in their absence than in their presence. That most successful people in any industry are praised to their face and analyzed behind their back, but that I was being talked about behind my back with something closer to respect than calculation. I asked him what the difference was. He thought about it and said, "When people are calculating your value, they're thinking about what you can do for them. When they respect you, they're thinking about what you could choose to do." I understood that. The difference was optionality. I had built optionality. I could choose what to attach my name to, which meant my name had genuine selectivity behind it. I could choose which investors to bring in, which meant investors competed for access. I could choose which talent to work with, which meant talent considered it meaningful to be chosen. The choices had accumulated into a form of power that was quiet, structural, and very difficult to undo. I want to tell you something about this power, because I think people misunderstand it. It doesn't feel the way you imagine it will feel when you're building toward it. There is no moment of arrival. There is no morning when you wake up and feel certain that you have won. The accumulation of power in a professional context is a gradual change in the set of options available to you, and the primary feeling associated with it is not triumph. It's a kind of calm, a reduction of anxiety. The anxiety that drove so many of the choices in those early years. The anxiety about whether I would make it, whether the work I was doing was building toward anything, whether the isolation and the sacrifice and the grueling stretch of years when nothing seemed to be moving was going to amount to something. That anxiety quietly receded, not all at once, in stages, until one day I noticed it was mostly gone. I was 35 when I began developing what would become the film that brought Paige Collins back into my life. The project started the way most good projects start, not with a fully formed idea, but with a feeling, a thematic territory I wanted to explore. I was interested in ambition and what it does to people. I was interested in the relationship between authentic desire and strategic desire, in whether it's possible to want something both genuinely and as an instrument for proving something to the world, and in what that split costs a person. I was interested in what happens when someone achieves what they've been working toward, and finds that the thing they've achieved was partly built on a version of themselves they can no longer fully inhabit. None of this was consciously autobiographical, or maybe it was entirely autobiographical, and I was protecting myself from that knowledge by treating it as intellectual material. Either way, it shaped into a story, the story of a woman in the performing arts, who is enormously talented and enormously driven, and who navigates her career with a kind of strategic intelligence that she doesn't entirely examine, and who arrives at a moment of visible success to find that the success feels hollow in ways she hadn't anticipated. I worked with a writer, a woman named Kelly Donovan, who I'd worked with on 2 previous projects and whose instincts I trusted completely, and we developed the script over the course of about a year. The lead character was complex. She was not simply a villain, not simply a cautionary tale. She was a full human being whose damage was specific and understandable, even when it was causing harm. Kelly understood that nuance deeply. She also knew nothing about Paige Collins. The character was not a portrait. The character was a distillation. When we had a script I was confident in, I brought in investors. That process went well, my name now carrying the weight I described earlier, and we had a real budget attached to a real production, with real distribution conversations underway. The casting process was substantial. We were looking for the lead actress with a genuine process. Open auditions, directed auditions, script readings, callbacks. When Lawson Gates' casting coordinator, Valerie Harper, meticulous and brilliant, and with radar for talent that I completely trusted, came to me with a list of candidates for the final round of auditions, I saw the name Paige Collins on it. I noted it. I said nothing. I looked at her reel, which Valerie had prepared along with all the other candidates' materials. She was good. She had gotten better in the years since she'd started. Her work had a lived-in quality that I hadn't seen in her high school performances. Something in the eyes, something about the body, like she'd learned through experience to stop reaching for emotion and let it come. I said to Valerie, include her in the final round. Valerie nodded and moved on to the next candidate's materials. She had no idea who Paige Collins was to me. As far as Valerie knew, this was a professional assessment of a professional candidate, which is exactly what it was. I will not pretend there was no other layer to it, but the professional layer was real. The final audition round was structured as a small event. Not a room of 40 people, but a gathering of maybe 12. Me, Valerie, the writer Kelly, 2 of the key investors, and the small group of finalists and their representatives. We held it in a conference space in our office that we'd cleared and set up for the occasion. It had a professional warmth to it. Good light, comfortable chairs, a feeling of occasion without intimidation. I was at the far end of the table when Paige Collins walked in. She was 35 now, the same age as me. She looked like herself, which sounds like a trivial thing to say, but is actually the most precise description I can offer. She had not been altered by time in the way that people sometimes are, had not either hardened or softened into something else. She was still precise in the way she moved, still had the same quality of attention in her eyes. She was wearing something simple and professional, the right choice for the environment. She scanned the room as she entered, the automatic social scan that performers do without thinking. When her eyes reached me, they stopped. I watched the recognition move through her face in layers. The first layer was the simple identification. She knew me. The second layer was the context. She understood where she was and who, therefore, I was. The third layer was a calculation happening in real time, a rapid assessment of the situation, of its implications, of what it meant that the boy from Ohio, who had filmed her audition tapes in his basement, was now sitting at the end of this table in this room with this power. It took about 3 seconds for all 3 layers to complete. Then her face settled into a professional expression that was almost perfect. Not quite perfect. There was something slightly too controlled about it, the way a face looks when someone is working at it. But almost. She took her seat. I greeted her and the other finalists with equal warmth. I introduced myself, as I do in these settings, briefly and without elaboration. I did not acknowledge that we knew each other. There was no reason to. The audition sessions were conducted in a standard format. Each candidate worked through prepared material with the writer in the room offering direction. Paige performed with genuine skill. She was compelling. The emotional range she demonstrated was real. This wasn't talent manufactured for the occasion, but something that had been developed over years of work, refined by experience, given depth by whatever her 15 years in the industry had put her through. I watched her work, and I felt the same thing I'd felt watching her in the school play at 16. Something move in my chest. Not affection this time, but recognition. She was good. She deserved to be in this room. What she did not yet understand was that being good enough to deserve the room was not the question I was in the process of answering. After the prepared sessions, I told the group that I was going to do something slightly unconventional for the final portion of the afternoon. I said that the central character of the film was someone who had spent many years operating from a split internal state, pursuing her ambitions with genuine passion while using the people around her as instruments without fully acknowledging that was what she was doing. I said that I wanted each candidate to improvise a short scene, the character in a moment of private honesty, confessing to herself and perhaps to one other person the shape of what she had actually been doing, admitting, clearly and without self-protection, that she had used someone who trusted her. I said this while looking at the group as a whole. I did not look at Paige specifically. I didn't need to. The candidates before her in the rotation produced good work, genuinely good, and I noted it. When it was Paige's turn, she stood up and took a moment. She breathed. And then she performed a scene that was extraordinary. She played the confession not as guilt, but as something more complicated, as a person examining their own mechanisms with clear eyes and a kind of exhausted self-knowledge. The character she created in those few minutes was someone who had done what she had done, not from simple callousness, but from a deep, unexamined belief that she was the kind of person who deserved help, who deserved to have her ambitions supported, who deserved to arrive, and who had not, until this moment, been willing to look at what that belief had cost the people around her. The scene had weight, it had truth. It was almost too convincing. When she sat down, there was a beat of silence in the room. Then I said, "Thank you, that was exceptional. It's rare to see someone portray that kind of mechanism so naturally, like the character already lives somewhere inside you." I said it with warmth. I said it with the tone of a compliment. The investors and Valerie and Kelly all heard it as a compliment. I watched Paige Collins receive it. Her smile was the right smile. Her nod was the right nod. But her eyes did something that no one else in the room was positioned to see, the way I was positioned to see it. Something between a flinch and a recognition, fast, contained, professional. There and gone in a fraction of a second. She had heard the second layer of what I said. She couldn't be certain I'd meant it. But she had heard it. In the days after the audition, I conducted a legitimate casting process. I reviewed recordings, I talked through candidates with Valerie and Kelly and the key investors. I thought carefully about the role and what it needed, and which actress could deliver the full range of what the script required. I chose Nina Edwards for the lead. This was not purely strategic. Nina was genuinely the right choice for the role. She had a quality of stillness that the character required in key scenes, a way of conveying internal life through small external movements that Paige's more expressive performance style didn't match as precisely. Kelly agreed with the assessment immediately when I put it to her. Valerie had Nina near the top of her own ranking. The decision was defensible on every artistic and professional basis, but I would not pretend to myself or to you now that the decision was made without any awareness of what it would mean. I was aware. I had been aware of what I was doing since the moment I saw Paige Collins' name on that final round list. I was building something, and the building was almost done. I called Paige's agent with the standard callback communication. We had chosen another actress for the lead, citing creative alignment, and we thanked her for the outstanding work in the audition process. Professional, clean. No explanation of the creative alignment question, because that's not standard practice, and elaboration would have been its own kind of message. Then I had a separate conversation with Valerie about a different possibility. The film had a promotional ambassador role, a visible position in the campaign around the film's release, attending events, conducting interviews, representing the project publicly in the period leading up to and following the premiere. It was a legitimate role with real visibility and real value. It was, however, not an acting role. It was a promotional role. The distinction was not subtle. I asked Valerie to reach out to Paige's representation about the position. I want to be precise about why I did this, and honest about the complexity of the reasoning. The surface layer was clean, she was recognizable, she was articulate, she was good in interviews, she had the professional bearing the role required, and the visibility would be real and meaningful for her career in certain ways. All of that was true. But beneath the surface layer was this: I was offering her a stage, and the stage was designed. I had written, in developing the film, a section of the press materials that described the emotional core of the script, the theme of ambition and calculated relationships, the character's arc of achievement shadowed by the cost of the mechanisms she had used to achieve it. This was genuinely part of the film's thematic DNA, but it was also, in the press conference context, material that would put Paige Collins in a room where she would be thanked, publicly, for inspiring a story about someone who manipulated people for professional gain. She would be on stage, in front of cameras, wearing a smile while I described her. She would know, and no one else would know. And she couldn't do anything about it because anything she could do, any reaction, any objection, any visible discomfort, would only confirm what I was implying. She accepted the position, through her agent, professionally. She was undoubtedly calculating the same things I would have calculated. The visibility was real, the film was serious, and the alternative was declining a legitimate opportunity. Out of a suspicion she couldn't verify or articulate. She was intelligent. She understood the terms. She took them anyway because the terms were too good to turn down. The press conference was held 3 weeks before the film's premiere. The conference room had good light, which I had arranged deliberately, and a full press presence. Nina Edwards was there as the lead actress. Kelly Donovan was there as the writer, the key investors, the distributors' representatives, the film's other principal cast, and Paige Collins as the film's promotional ambassador, seated at the panel table in a position that was visible and prominent. I opened by talking about the film, its themes, its creative ambitions, what we were hoping it would do for audiences. I talked about the casting process with genuine warmth, about Nina's extraordinary work, about Kelly's script. I talked about the team. Then I said something about the film's origins. I said that this particular story, its central character, the emotional arc at the film's core, had not emerged from abstraction, but from a period of genuine reflection on real experiences. That the character's specific combination of talent and calculation, of authentic ambition interwoven with a strategic manipulation of the people around her, had been shaped by a real encounter I had had years earlier that had left me with a very precise understanding of what that psychology looks and feels like from the inside of its impact. I said that certain real experiences had inspired elements of the character's emotional arc, that the film's themes of ambition and calculated relationships were shaped by real encounters, and that I was grateful for the education, however uncomfortable it had been at the time. I turned to Paige Collins. I thanked her directly, warmly, with the full attention of the room. I said that her presence in the project, both in the audition process, where she had illuminated the character with exceptional skill, and now as the film's ambassador, felt to me like a complete arc, like the story had found its way back to its source. I smiled. It was a real smile. The cameras captured everything. They captured my face. They captured her face, her face. She held it with professional skill. The smile was in place. The posture was composed. She nodded graciously and said something brief and appropriate. She was good. She had always been good. But I had been watching her face for almost 20 years in one form or another, and I knew what good looked like when it was working at capacity. I knew what composed looked like when it was suppressing something. I knew, in the specific quality of stillness in her eyes, that she understood exactly what had just happened. that she understood where she was, and what she was sitting in, and whose hands had designed the stage she was sitting on. She was in a spotlight. She was visible and documented and publicly present. She was being credited with inspiring a story about someone who manipulates people to advance their career. And there was nothing she could do, because the mechanism was invisible, because everything I'd said was professionally appropriate, because the framing was warm and the credits were genuine, and the room heard a successful producer thanking a colleague. Only she could hear the second layer. The applause at the end of the press conference was warm and sustained. The film premiered on a Thursday night in October. The venue was downtown, a theater I'd always admired, with good acoustics and a lobby that fills well. The evening was clean and professional, and everything ran as planned. Nina was radiant. Kelly was gracious and slightly overwhelmed in the best way. The investors were satisfied. I stood backstage in the period between the red carpet and the screening, in a corridor with industrial lighting and the sound of the theater filling on the other side of the wall. I had changed out of the tuxedo jacket briefly, holding it over one arm, and I was alone for about 10 minutes, in a way that I rarely am at these events. I wasn't thinking about Paige Collins. I want to be precise about that. I had thought about her for much of the preparation for this evening. She had been present in the architecture of many decisions I had made in the past year, and in the accumulation of decisions over the 20 years before that. But in this moment, backstage, in the industrial light, I wasn't thinking about her. I was thinking about my father, who worked at a parts distribution facility in Ohio, and who told me that serious people tend to find their way. I was thinking about the camera I had bought as a teenager with money from a grocery store job, and the short films I had made in a neighborhood park where the light came through the trees, in a way that made me feel like I was seeing something true. I was thinking about the 20 minutes I had sat in a car in a high school parking lot without starting it, holding something in my chest that I didn't have the framework yet to process. I was thinking about all the years between that car and this corridor, the isolation, the second job, the money accumulating in amounts. That took years to matter. Owen Bradley's spare office with no art on the walls, Trevor's visual intelligence, Nina's stillness, Kelly's instincts, all the rooms and all the decisions and all the mornings I woke up, and the work was still there to do, and I did it. I had built this. It was real. It was mine. It was not owed to anyone, and it was not a performance for anyone, and it was not the fulfillment of a fantasy I had once spent too much time running in my head. It was the product of years of genuine labor, and it was good, and the audience was about to see it, and they would feel something true. Standing there, I understood something that I had been approaching for a long time, without fully arriving at it. The most refined thing I had done was not the press conference moment. The most refined thing was not the casting decision, or the promotional contract, or the script reading, where I asked her to portray manipulation so naturally. All of those things were real, and all of them had the geometry I intended, and I don't entirely regret any of them. But the most refined thing I had done, the thing that could not be taken from me, the thing that required the full 20 years and every sacrifice in them, was the film itself. The film was good. The film was honest. The film was made by a person who had understood something real about the world and turned it into a story that other people would feel. And the story was not about revenge, and it was not about winning, and it was not about the woman who had used me at 17. The story was about ambition and its costs, and it was true, and it would outlast every strategic maneuver I had ever made, and every score I had ever thought about settling. That was the thing she couldn't touch. That was always going to be the thing she couldn't touch. The most devastating thing you can do to someone who used you as an instrument for their ambitions is to demonstrate that your ambitions were real, that what you built is real, that without the manipulation, without the cruelty, without the calculation, you would have built something worth building. that you were never just an instrument, that you were always the main character of a story she didn't understand she was in. I put my jacket back on. I walked back out to the lobby. The theater filled. The film ran. I've been trying to figure out how to end this, and I keep coming back to the same problem. There's no ending that resolves cleanly, because the things I'm describing didn't resolve cleanly. There's no last page where I look around at my life and find that I'm whole, find that the years of isolation didn't leave marks, find that the strategic architecture I built around a wound has stopped casting shadows. I am successful by the measures I set for myself 20 years ago. More than successful. I have made things I'm proud of. I have relationships. Real ones, grown slowly from nothing to something, with people who know me and who I know back. I live in a city I chose, in a life I assembled from its foundations, and I am not waiting for anyone's approval of it. And I am also someone who spent 20 years with a part of himself organized around a humiliation received at 17. I am also someone for whom professional achievement has always carried a secondary charge. Not just the intrinsic pleasure of the work, but the satisfaction of the demonstration, the proof, the irrefutable evidence that I was not what she thought I was. I am also someone who constructed a public moment at a press conference with careful precision so that a specific person could hear a second layer that no one else could hear. I am also someone who, in an industrial corridor backstage at a premiere, spent 10 minutes thinking about his father instead of thinking about the woman from his past, and found that the thinking about his father was what he needed to think about, and found that the woman had already gotten smaller in the accounting of his life. There is a cost to building yourself in opposition to something. The opposition becomes structural. It becomes part of the foundation, and you can't remove it without threatening the building. I don't know if I would do any of it differently. I genuinely don't know. The version of me who does it differently is a version who emerges from that high school corridor and processes the overheard conversation in some healthier, cleaner way, who goes to therapy or talks to a friend or writes about it or cries about it in some productive manner, and who then proceeds to build a career from a place of pure, untainted ambition. That version is possible. It might have gotten here faster. It might have gotten here with less damage. But it might not have gotten here at all. Because here is something I've had to sit with. The anger was fuel, not clean fuel, dirty, corrosive, smoky fuel that fouled things when I let it burn freely, but fuel. And there were years, particularly the years of isolation and the period that looked like defeat, when I'm not certain that clean fuel would have been sufficient, when the thing that kept me working in the dark, kept me putting money away and reading until late and refusing to accept the plateau as a permanent condition, when that thing was not pure ambition, but the specific, colder, harder thing underneath pure ambition, the need to prove. I can't fully endorse that. I can't tell you that it's the right way to build a life. I won't stand at the end of this story and tell you to find your Paige Collins and let her hurt you so that you can build something in response. That's not a model. That's survivorship bias dressed as wisdom. What I can tell you is this: I survived the doing of it. I came out the other side with a career and a life and a self that I recognize and don't entirely regret. The marks are there. They're permanent. I know where the edges of me are and what they're made of and what made them that way. There is a clarity in that knowledge that I value, even though the clarity came from a dark place. The film did well. It's still doing well. It'll probably outlast most of the other work from that period. Kelly's script holds up. Nina's performance is something people will watch and feel and remember. The story is true in the ways that matter. Paige Collins performed her role as promotional ambassador, professionally and well. She went on to other work. I haven't seen her since the premiere. I don't expect to. She did inspire the film. Not in the way I said at the press conference. not with warmth and gratitude and the implied blessing of acknowledged influence. She inspired it the way injury inspires compensation, the way a break that heals slightly wrong shapes how a person moves for the rest of their life. The shape of the break is still in there, it's permanent. I'm standing at the end of this story feeling what I always feel at the end of things I've worked on for a long time, a specific tiredness that has warmth in it, and underneath the warmth, a kind of vast quiet, and in the quiet, the echo of every choice that led here, and the knowledge that the choices were mine, all of them, even the ones that cost the most, even the ones made from the wrong place for the wrong reasons that somehow contributed to the right outcome. I won. It changed me permanently. I've made peace with both of those things. Not complete peace, the working kind, the kind that holds. That's all I have. Stories like this happen more than you think. Someone right now is sitting in silence, building something the people who underestimated them will never see coming. Subscribe. The next story is already waiting.